Confederate General Robert E. Lee has held a dynamic reputation throughout the years. From his earliest achievements to the modern day, Lee's name has come to evoke thoughts of several seemingly different men, from the benevolent to the malicious, from a tactical mastermind to a mediocre military leader, and from that has stemmed a great deal of controversy over the life and legacy of this very important figure in American history, one whose identity and motives are more complex than the average person might think. Lee was the son of a relatively prominent statesman and major general who had served under George Washington in the Continental Army. Despite this foundation for a seemingly fortunate background, Robert Lee's youth was more humble and turbulent than one might think. In the years following his military and political career, Robert's father, Henry Lee, also known as Light Horse Harry, would find himself in deep financial trouble, so much so that he was forced to serve time in a labor prison to pay off his debt. During this time, Robert had only recently been born, and consequently the demands of Henry's life left him absent from much of his son's life. Despite this, Henry's main concern immediately upon release from confinement was that his son receive a quality education and the foundational knowledge he had neglected to pass down to Robert himself, all in the hope that he might one day restore the family's tarnished honor. The tragedy of Henry Lee would reach a climax in 1812 with the outbreak of the war named after that same year. A devoted Federalist steeped in what had become the Democratic Republican anti-Federalist heartland of Virginia, Henry was no stranger to political persecution, but with the outbreak of a polarizing war, that animosity between the two sides only intensified, especially on the side of the Democratic Republicans. A riot in Baltimore had erupted when a Federalist newspaper published an anti-war article which the Democratic Republicans attacked as pro-British and extremist. The mob of Democratic Republicans completely destroyed the newspaper office and assaulted its workers. A member of the mob had lost his life in the process, and this only incited the Democratic Republicans to become more aggressive, targeting and attacking anyone even accused of Federalist or British sympathies. Soon after, the paper's owner would set up shop in a local residence and enlist Henry Lee to protect him from the rioters. Lee did precisely that, but eventually he and his associates were forced to stand down by local officials, who escorted Lee and the paper staff to the Baltimore prison, where they were promised by the mayor that they would be kept under close protection. However, none would be provided. That night, the rioters, several hundred in number, broke into the prison with little resistance. What followed was hours of horrific and sickening brutality. Henry Lee, left in devastated health, would leave the country for a more mild climate in the Caribbean, hoping it would help him to recover, but destitute and with little hope for improvement, he would attempt to make his way back home, only reaching Georgia before finally passing away. Young Robert would only be 11 years old at the time, and it would be nearly another year before he learned of his father's fate. Though left primarily in the care of his mother, Lee did not grow effeminate, nor would his mother allow him to. She was a woman of high virtue, encouraged him to spend time with his male friends and relatives, and continually instilled in him a strong morality, which in turn was reinforced by the leftover writings of Robert's father, reminders to hold virtue above glory and remain honorable in all he did. Robert would soon find himself as the head of the household, caring for his now ailing mother and younger sister, and tending to his affordable education at the same time. What little leisure remained available to Robert was spent with school chums and other members of the family, including his half-brother Black Horse Harry, or Henry Lee IV, a speechwriter for President Jackson and Vice President Calhoun. Eventually, Robert would find himself at a crossroads of sorts. Fresh out of school, he now considered what path he'd follow as an adult, and of the fields which called out to him, the military was not his first choice. It was, however, the most affordable option, and for a man low on funds but strong in discipline, it appeared an excellent opportunity. That being said, West Point still required Lee to meet certain criteria, and even then would need to be lucky enough to be selected among several other applicants. Ultimately, it would be his family's connection to John Calhoun that would secure Lee's place and ensure his star continued to rise in a military profession. He'd become a promising military engineer with a pristine record and apply his knowledge across the country in years of dedicated service to the military. Within a matter of years, Lee would be one of the country's leading military officers. Having distinguished himself in the Mexican-American War, he was now eyed by many as the rightful successor to America's then most prominent and commanding general, Winfield Scott. It was Scott himself who would recommend Robert to Lincoln when it became apparent the nation was beginning to fracture and force would be necessary to hold it together. Scott was well along in age, now in his 70s, and having held his position as commander for 2 decades, he understood it was time for a new lion to lead the pride and could think of no better successor than Lee. Robert was now presented a great opportunity, a promotion to Major General and the power to lead the United States Army if he would use it to crush the Southern Rebellion, but deep inside, Lee was conflicted. Robert loved the United States, and he believed that no proper alternative to total perpetual union could be achieved without desecrating all which the founders had fought, died, paid, and planned for. However, for the federal government to raise arms against the individual states, for a country to declare war upon itself, it went beyond extreme and would forever change the nation's soul. In his eyes, it was treasonous for the states to secede, but equally immoral to preserve the Union through violent coercion. It was a decision which ate at him, especially so as his home state of Virginia teetered on the issue of secession itself, and if it did in fact move to secede, so would he be brought to lead an army against his native land. He belonged to both his state and his country, but only Virginia was home. It was where his family lived for generations, a land his brothers, cousins, fathers, and forefathers had built themselves. It was a monument to his family, and as Lee recalled the virtues he was taught as a boy, he knew the only honorable choice would be to stand by it regardless of which side it took. Ultimately, Virginia would secede, and Lee would promptly resign from the US military. As he had written just weeks before, "I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union, and I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation." Recognizing that Virginia now stood as the front line of the North-South War, he had no choice but to throw his lot in with the Confederates to defend his home state. In only a matter of days, the Union's last best hope for a swift victory had changed sides. Lee was appointed commander of Virginia until proper organization of the Confederacy was achieved, at which point he was but one of a few generals. From the get-go, some in the South looked upon Lee as a tide-turning force of the war, so much so that he was formally presented the Sword of Washington. However, he would not live up to those expectations immediately. In fact, Lee quickly became the target of some ridicule by even his fellow soldiers. The gentle and reserved nature he developed while caring for his sickly mother had still shined through, and it did not help the perception of his unorthodox battle strategies. That is, until they finally worked, and continued to work nearly without fail. See, Lee was a planner. He took time to make proper judgments which translated into superior strategies. While his peers engaged with the enemy head-on, Lee was digging trenches around the capital, fortifying local defenses, and collecting intelligence on Union tactics. Lee saw the war for what it was. The Union could not be defeated, nor did he want it to be. Rather, the South merely needed to survive, and it would do so by exhausting its enemy and holding the line. When it was finally Lee's time to take command, every piece fell right into place, over and over again, causing the Union so much concern that they replaced their newly appointed commanding general twice. Lee had successfully won the campaign of Northern Virginia and was preparing to move the front lines onto Union territory. It was only upon the leaking of Lee's plans via Special Order 191 that his hold on the conflict began to slip, and though he did well to quickly reorganize, it was at this point that the South had lost its upper hand. Both sides began funneling more into the war effort, and Northern forces, now under General Grant, adopted a policy of total war, inflicting mass destruction upon the South in any way it could to finally force their submission. Even as Union forces were closing in, some insisted that Lee continue to fight on, that the war be taken to Appalachia where the South could mount a last stand and retain a chance of holding the Union off. But Lee knew well that all which could be reasonably done had been done. To quote Robert's farewell address following his formal surrender, "After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the survivors of so many hard-fought battles who have remained steadfast to the last that I have consented to the result from no distrust of them, but feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss that must have attended the continuance of the contest, I have determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen." And with that surrender, so did others follow, and the war came to an end. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Robert E. Lee decided to join the Union in the belief that it would lead to a swifter victory, and thus less destruction, even if it meant standing against his home state? Before going any further, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor. You know who we're talking about, Ridge Wallet. In every store, on every shelf. That's a different color. This one has a different pattern. It's easy to be the same as everyone else. Sure, but why reinvent the wheel? Why fix it if it isn't broken? Maybe it can be done better. Yeah, countless try. Only the very best succeed. This season, pick up the wallet that's changing the game. Go to ridge.com/MonsierZ and use promo code MonsierZ at checkout for a discount and free shipping. Now, back to the video. Without Lee's masterful planning and with such skill instead bolstering the Union, the Confederacy would almost certainly be defeated far more quickly in this alternate timeline. The Peninsula Campaign would be a success, and Richmond, Virginia, no longer secured by Lee's defenses, becomes a quick conquest. The Confederacy would have nearly been defeated, but the rebellion continues on, with the government and capital simply moving back to Montgomery, Alabama. However, with Virginia brought back into line so early on, North Carolina and Tennessee may re-enter the Union willingly to avoid a devastating campaign through their lands. Neither was as heavily invested in the war as the Deep South had been, and both only seceded after Virginia had. So with that first piece removed, these two could be expected to follow, thus concentrating the war exclusively on the Deep South, which would fall within a year. Because of this, it's unlikely the Emancipation Proclamation would be issued as it had been in our world, as by the time Lincoln would have completed the document, the war would nearly be over, and the document was specifically targeted towards states, quote, in rebellion. Aside from fulfilling the desires of abolitionists within the Union, Lincoln had created the proclamation as a means of further crippling Southern stability by both denying them slave labor and allowing for the incorporation of former slaves into the Union Army. Without what Lincoln referred to as military necessity, he believed he could not constitutionally abolish slavery within the pacified states, and thus there's little chance for such a drastic decision to be made in this world. Emancipation would instead take on a gradual character of being slowly phased out over the course of a century through the aid of government buybacks or financial incentives to release any held slaves, and in that time it's likely a greater number of these freed slaves would be resettled in Liberia or a new freedman colony, the latter of which Lincoln had suggested throughout his presidency, claiming several issues with the Liberian model. The expansion of slavery would still be halted, confining it to the American Southeast, where, as we just mentioned, it would slowly fade away, though its total eradication may be unlikely unless additional legislation was implemented. The war would have ultimately been less impactful and kept the pace of previous years. Because there's no great destruction, both on account of Lee's less callous tactics and the conflict's shorter span, there's no radical reconstruction of the South, allowing the institutions of the region to remain intact and politically active. This means there is no decades-long era of Republican rule as there had been in our timeline, but a continued rivalry between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats, whose platform would begin to evolve so as to appeal to the populations of the newly forming non-slave states. Even despite the war's early end, Lee, as in our timeline, would be burdened by his actions during the conflict, unable to shake the bothersome sense that he had betrayed his home of Virginia, even if it was in the name of preserving the Union. He would resign from his position, having achieved a military rank equal only to Washington's own, and which would have been awarded to Grant in our timeline. Post-war, Lee would be a polarizing figure, seen by some in the South as a traitor, while others remember him as the soldier who preserved the Union. Regardless, it was attention Lee did not want, and as he'd originally intended to do in our timeline, would retire to a farm where he would live out in quiet isolation, a life akin to a 19th century Cincinnatus. Though he'd now certainly be a perfectly primed candidate for the upcoming presidential election of 1864, or possibly Lincoln's running mate, it's not an office Lee would have been likely to take up. Though he was a man of great skill and character, his virtue ultimately kept his ambitions in line. Lee was easily far less ambitious of a man than even Washington, who though often regarded as hesitant to lead, had felt the call of greatness since his youth, and channeled it into several glory-seeking ventures. Lee, on the other hand, simply wanted a respectable career and to carry out that career honorably. It's been suggested by some that in his later life he even came to regret following a military path, as it forced him to compromise on his beliefs and led to a terrible loss of life, which he no doubt blamed himself for. The burden of leadership does not seem like something Lee would simply pursue for his own pleasure. It wouldn't even be something he'd take up if it were requested of him, as we can see from his rejecting the opportunity to lead Union forces in our timeline. That said, Lincoln might encourage him to take up the opportunity for the sake of helping along North-South reconciliation, but still he would decline. Only in the odd chance Lincoln were to still be assassinated and the country once again thrown into chaos would Lee feel it necessary to fill the seat of power. Fearing harsh treatment for the South by the radical Republicans in Congress and a second Southern secession in response, Lee would utilize his status as hero of the Union and son of the South to keep the nation together as best he could. Though once again he would answer this call to action begrudgingly, he knew that it was a call he could not simply ignore. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.